this threat has been on the cards for quite some time. We've got a huge number of Russian troops and indeed an awful lot of Russian hardware. It's not on the Ukrainian border. It's quite a few miles back, but no one knows why it would be there for any other reason. Lots of talk about wanting to take certainly the Donbass region, the sort of the eastern half of Ukraine, after taking, of course, Crimea already. And not much sign that any of the talks between US, NATO and Russia have made any headway. Do you think that we are going to see Russia invade Crimea?
Well, I think all possibilities are on the table. What we're seeing is an example of what President Putin has called power diplomacy. It's a replication of what used to happen in the 1930s. You mass troops on somebody's border. If you don't get your way, you pick your time and place when you want to actually apply that force. I think, if I'm honest, President Putin would like to establish a land bridge to Crimea. And as you say, that may include occupying the Donbass, eastern Ukraine region. I think his ambition stretches beyond that. I think he wants to drive across to Odessa and cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea. And if he can get away with it, I think he'll attempt it.
Well, indeed.
But I think we need to put this in some sort of proportion. The Russian armed forces need to be kept employed. It's one of the power bases within Russia that Putin has to keep quiet. So by keeping them occupied, it's rather like Roman legionaries in Britain. If you don't want them to revolt, you get them to build a wall between what is now England and Scotland.
So it's something to do. I wish it was so benign as that, but given the sabre rattling we've heard, and we know that this message that Vladimir Putin wants to send out to the Russian people, this sort of mother Russia, this that Russia has been, the Soviet Union's collapse has sort of made Russia not the sort of powerful, important nation state that it's superpower it should be, and he wants it to be again. But we know that there is a real unwillingness on the West to take action, whether it's Russia, whether it's China. We see this again and again. And there's real concern that the European Union, even America, NATO, representing all of these nations, isn't willing to actually take action. They might wag fingers, there might be economic sanctions, but they're not actually willing to stump up troops to actually defend Ukraine, an independent nation state, from invasion. What are your fears there? If Russia does actually go in, what is the likelihood that the West will actually do anything about it?
I think what we have to remember as realists, Julia, is that Ukraine is more important to Putin than it is to Europe and the West. And that's the simple fact. If you look at the interests at stake, if you take out the principles around democracy and freedom of choice, all that sort of thing, then actually the interests of the West in Ukraine are negligible compared to what, as you say, it means to Putin.
But it does matter. This is a nation state that matters. When they took the nuclear warheads out and it left the Soviet Union, there was an international treaty which was very clear that it was to remain a neutral, independent state. That was very crucial. And there were all these moves which Vladimir Putin used to justify the invasion of Crimea, of the EU sort of tempting Ukraine to join, NATO even being considered. Now, the reality is Putin and most Russians would regard that as a hostile act. They want that buffer. We've kind of, to a certain extent, I'm not justifying anything Putin's done, but we are kind of walking into this, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that President Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union, either economically or politically. I mean, we saw recently Russian troops going into Kazakhstan to prop up a friendly regime. The same is true in Belarus. And it's not just a buffer. I mean, Putin knows there's no real threat from NATO. NATO's a defensive alliance. Russia is, quite frankly, an aggressive, hostile power towards the West. He needs to generate the sort of nationalist rhetoric in order to keep his people together. The economy is in spiral. He knows that oil and gas is a diminishing resource. That's where most of his foreign currency reserves come from. He's sticking close to China. And what we're seeing, Julia, is something we talked about before, the Eurasian autocracies, China, Russia, Iran, are ranged against the maritime democracies. This is the new world order. It's a two-block world. And Afghanistan and Ukraine, frankly, are in that borderland, that rimland between those two blocks right now. And we're going to see constant fights over the self-determination of countries in that area in future, all across the world.
Morning everybody, David Cluse here from UNN. Yeah, I want to make this video about the situation that's ongoing on the Ukraine border. Obviously we've been following that. There's a big build-up of Russian troops. But the question I'm asking is, what the hell is this government playing at? Ben Wallace, another complete globalist shill. All these, like Tobias Ellwood, all these twats, it's none of our business. Okay, look, I've got a lot of sympathy with Ukraine. I like a lot of some what goes on in Russia as well. It is a very complicated history between these two countries in the Donbass regions, a lot of Russian speakers, etc. as well. It's too complicated. It's nothing to do with us. Yeah, and good on Germany for stopping RAF flights from flying over them to get there. We're giving Ukraine's weapons. We're giving them training as well. They're not even a NATO ally. It's absolutely despicable. But again, this is the problem that we have with this country. They're more interested in something going on in Ukraine rather than say what's going on in the English Channel or what's even going on in this country. Because the people that run this country don't care about this country. They care about their position, they care about their prestige, and they care about what their foreign interests and donors tell them. We're becoming like a wee mini America. It's absolutely despicable. So look, we should be having nothing to do with what is going on in Ukraine. My hope is that there's no war there. You don't want to see people dying, that they manage to de-escalate and find a peaceful solution to it. So we certainly shouldn't be getting involved. Updates throughout the day on Telegram and Twitter. Please follow us there. Bye-bye.
The eastern Ukraine front lines. Russian-backed separatists just a few kilometers away. While the world watches and waits to see if Russia invades, these Ukrainian soldiers say war is already here. A soldier shows us a POM-2 mine, an old weapon, but being used by the Russian-backed separatists in a new way, delivered by drone.
Everything is inside. There's a detonator that activates this. When hitting the bottom, part of it separates. After this comes another step, it throws out all the threads. And then it stands in the ready mode. After that, if something touches, it detonates.
Whilst tensions with Russia have escalated, the Ukrainian military have been preparing.
You can win anything, occupy territory, but this territory will still need to be retained, and in order to keep it, it must be captured. There is a strong army here. Here, in these 8 years, people, well, it won't happen.
A short drive from the front lines, and the villages around Avdiivka are almost totally abandoned. Few locals remain after the last large-scale Russian incursion.
This is where a lot of people left. Now just 35 people live here, and there used to be 800.
The consequences of 8 years of conflict with Russia, everywhere you look. Bombed out homes, broken windows, children's toys abandoned. And a sign from those who'd lived here. Help and save us. The reasons for the latest escalation are many and complex. But Russia has insisted NATO's expansion is unacceptable and has set a demand that NATO never allow Ukraine membership. A demand both NATO and many Ukrainians have ruled out.
We want to join NATO, we have a course for NATO, and their support is important to us.
Signs along these roads warn those still here of danger. The territory around these roads are mined and potentially deadly. We're here at a checkpoint in the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, and not far beyond this is the final point, beyond which is occupied territory held by Russian-backed separatists. Now, this gives you an idea of the proximity of the Ukrainians living very nearby here in towns and villages to those front lines. It's a very tense moment for Ukraine, with the threat of a Russian invasion looming over the country. But our military sources have told us from the front lines that the soldiers are calm and they're ready.
Does my right honourable friend agree that as well as helping Ukraine militarily, we need to constantly make clear to President Putin that his very concept of a Russian near abroad, the veto over the security and foreign policies of his geographic neighbours, is at odds with international law and completely at odds with the concept of self-determination? And does he agree that what we are witnessing now is a classic example of the KGB doctrine of reflexive control, which is all too often a precursor to Russian military action?
Secretary of State. I think what we are saying, as the United States said, is the playbook, Madam Deputy Speaker: narratives, cyber attacks, disruption of minorities, division, all preyed upon that country. But I also think there is something else, which is what are the consequences of a successful military invasion in Ukraine for the rest of Europe. Last week I visited Sweden and Finland, when countries like that are genuinely concerned and worried by their neighbours, a proper, strong European countries, not members of NATO, are worried, we should sit up and listen, all of us in Europe, because the consequence after a Ukrainian invasion, if that was to be successful, is what else for the other ambitions of the president?
That's a good question. Nobody knows, and because nobody knows what he's actually planning and what he's baking. This 100,000, which is on our border, is not enough to topple down our military. But we are not faced with this 100,000. We are faced with the whole million of Russians, which have the supply to come at any, if they decide to do something nasty. And again, there are additional forces in Crimea. There is somebody on the west of Ukraine in the Transnistria. So we are more or less surrounded. And Belarus is now becoming, it's not just a lie, it's becoming Russia as well, with the forces, Russian forces and Belarusian forces on the ground.
And do you have confidence in your allies? There's a lot of rhetoric about supporting and helping Ukraine. We heard there from our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, about issues maybe around the airspace from NATO allies. Are you hearing that too? And are you confident about the support of EU allies?
You see, I like the word you use, allies. My biggest problem is that we are not one of the allies. We are not member of NATO. This is the biggest problem we face right now, because people are saying, even here, that guys, unfortunately, you are not in NATO. You can expect us seriously that will come to help you with the boots on the ground. We are partners.
You accept that? You accept that that's not going to happen?
I hate it. I accept it. I hate it, though, because that's what we're facing. We wanted to be in NATO. It's not us who didn't allow us to get this membership. So now we're not a part of the family, and we are facing the biggest army in Europe by ourselves, with assistance, with some additional rockets and some additional training, but still we're so inequality here in the forces, in the number of troops and rockets, planes, helicopters, everything.
What sources of information, what streams of information coming out of the region do you trust, and what is your assessment of what's happening right now?
Well, you set it up well, Nicole. I mean, Putin has a pistol to the head of Ukraine, and he's making all kinds of threats. And the U.S. doesn't have all that much leverage. I mean, what Putin always bargains on is that Ukraine means more to me, Vladimir Putin, than it does to Joe Biden. Ukraine means more to Russia than it does to the U.S. Ukraine means more to Russia than it even does to the European Union. So that's why he's constantly threatening Ukraine. He wants to exact something for it. I think coming out of those talks last week, I think there are many opportunities for negotiation on intermediate range missiles, which Trump pulled out of that 1987 agreement, negotiation on military exercises, negotiating on the number of troops in nearby countries. I think there's lots to negotiate on, and I hope Putin comes to his senses, that because an invasion of Ukraine is a disaster. It's a ground war in the middle of Europe, and that's not something that anybody wants, and that's a prelude to even worse things.